He was a successful judge who was just rushing to work when his car broke down and he called a taxi. But this trip turned into a nightmare when a racist taxi driver turned an ordinary day into a fight for life and justice. False accusations, a brutal arrest, and injustice, all this could ruin his fate. But what happened next will definitely surprise you. Watch to the end to find out the whole truth. Subscribe to the channel and leave your comments. Your support helps us make more of these videos. Let's play a little game before the story begins. Only 5% of all people in the world can subscribe to the channel within 5 seconds. We'll check it out now. Time has passed. Subscribe to the channel within 5 seconds. It's okay if you didn't have time. Don't worry. It will turn out next time. And congratulations to those who did. You are very cool. The sun was barely rising, casting a pale glow over the city streets as Judge Malcolm Price hurried through his morning routine. Today was a critical day. A high-profile case was scheduled, and he couldn't afford to be late. As he adjusted his tie in front of the mirror, he felt a surge of determination. Being a black man in the judicial system hadn't been easy, but Malcolm had worked tirelessly to build his reputation as a fair and respected judge. Today was another chance to prove that justice could prevail. Regardless of the challenges, he grabbed his briefcase and keys, heading to the garage where his car waited. But as he turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered and died. He tried again. Nothing. His heartbeat quickened as he checked the time on his watch. There was no way he could afford to wait for a tow truck and miss the start of the hearing. Not today. Come on, he muttered under his breath, giving the dashboard a frustrated tap. But the car remained stubbornly silent. With a sigh, he pulled out his phone and opened a ride-share app. Within a few minutes, a car pulled up, a beat-up sedan with a sticker that read, "Best Ride in Town," plastered across the side. Malcolm glanced at the driver's profile on the app. Tom, a middle-aged man with a generic smile in his photo. Malcolm climbed into the back seat, and Tom gave him a quick, cursory glance in the rearview mirror. There was something about the way his eyes lingered on Malcolm's face that made the judge feel uneasy, but he brushed it off. He had more important things to worry about. He gave the address of the courthouse and settled back, hoping the ride would be quick and uneventful. The first few minutes of the drive passed in silence, the city slowly waking up around them. Malcolm glanced out the window, mentally preparing for the arguments he would hear in court. But his thoughts were interrupted when Tom cleared his throat, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "So, you're heading downtown this early. Must be some kind of important job you got there," Tom said, his tone carrying an edge that made Malcolm look up. He recognized the veiled hostility, the way some people disguised contempt as casual conversation. "Yes, I'm a judge," Malcolm replied evenly, trying to keep the interaction professional. He had learned long ago that it was better not to engage with hostility unless absolutely necessary. Tom let out a short, humorless laugh. "A judge, huh? Don't see many of you kinds in that position." He said the words with a deliberate pause, letting the implication hang in the air. Malcolm felt a prickle of irritation, but kept his expression neutral. "Times change," he said simply, turning his gaze back to the window. He wasn't about to let a ride-share driver ruin his morning, but Tom seemed determined to push further. "Yeah, times sure do change, though I gotta say, some things shouldn't. Like people ought to know their place, don't you think?" Tom's voice had taken on a sharper edge, his grip on the steering wheel tightening as he glanced back at Malcolm through the mirror. Malcolm took a slow breath, feeling the tension settle into the air between them. "Just drive, please," he said, his tone firm but calm. He could feel his patience wearing thin, but he reminded himself that engaging with this man wouldn't help the situation. All he needed was to get to the courthouse. The rest of the drive continued in thick, uncomfortable silence. Malcolm kept his eyes fixed on the passing buildings, ignoring the simmering resentment he felt from the front seat. He had dealt with this kind of attitude before. He knew it was best to stay silent, to let it slide off his back like rain. Finally, the courthouse came into view. Malcolm felt a wave of relief wash over him as the car rolled to a stop. He quickly gathered his things and glanced at the fare on the meter. $25, as expected. He took out his wallet and handed Tom the cash. "Here's your fare. Thank you for the ride," Malcolm said, his tone clipped but polite. He turned to step out of the car, but Tom's hand shot out, gripping his arm tightly. "Not so fast," Tom growled, his eyes flashing with barely concealed anger. "You owe me double. You people don't get to pay the same as everyone else. $50, or there'll be trouble." Malcolm froze, feeling a surge of disbelief. "The fare is $25, as shown on the meter. That's what I'm paying you. Now let go of my arm," he said, his voice cold and steady, but inside, his nerves buzzed with tension. He could see the way Tom's face, twisted with rage, could feel the strength of the driver's grip, tightening painfully around his arm. Tom's face contorted with fury, and for a moment, Malcolm thought the driver might back down. But instead, Tom yanked him out of the car with a violent pull, sending Malcolm stumbling onto the sidewalk. Before he could regain his balance, Tom's fist collided with his jaw, sending him reeling backward. Malcolm hit the ground hard, his briefcase skidding across the pavement as pain exploded through his face. He barely had time to process what was happening before Tom was on him, landing punch after punch, shouting insults that echoed in the empty street. Blood filled Malcolm's mouth, and he struggled to protect himself, his arms coming up instinctively to shield his head. It felt like an eternity before Tom finally stopped. Panting heavily, his face flushed with anger, Malcolm lay on the ground, gasping for breath, his vision blurred and his body aching with pain. He could hear the sound of footsteps. A few people had stopped, drawn by the commotion, their faces filled with shock and confusion, but no one moved to intervene. Tom reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone with a satisfied smirk. He dialed a number, his voice turning suddenly panicked as he spoke into the receiver. "Yeah, this is Tom. I was just attacked by a passenger. He tried to rob me, and I had to defend myself. Send help quick." Malcolm could only stare up at the sky, his mind spinning with disbelief and pain. He heard the distant wail of sirens growing closer, and he knew that his morning had just taken a turn he could never have anticipated. Malcolm lay on the cold pavement, the metallic taste of blood filling his mouth as he struggled to sit up. His vision swam, and pain radiated from his bruised ribs and face. Around him, a few curious onlookers had gathered, their expressions shifting from confusion to concern as they took in the scene. Malcolm could hear snippets of their hushed whispers, but his head was too foggy to make sense of their words. Tom, however, was still in full performance mode. The moment the police car screeched to a stop at the curb, he sprinted toward them, waving his arms and putting on a show of desperation. "Officers, officers, thank God you're here," he shouted, his voice thick with fake distress. "That man, he tried to rob me. He attacked me when I wouldn't give him his way." The officers, two middle-aged men with stern faces and matching uniforms, exchanged a quick glance before turning their attention to Malcolm, who was struggling to get back on his feet. They sized him up in an instant, his rumpled suit, the blood on his face, the way he clutched his side. Without a word, they stepped closer, their hands drifting toward their batons. Malcolm tried to raise a hand to explain, but his voice came out hoarse and broken. "This is a lie. I'm the one who was attacked. Get down on the ground, now," one of the officers barked, cutting him off. There was no hint of hesitation in his voice, no sign that he might even consider Malcolm's words. Tom, meanwhile, continued his act, clutching at his own shirt as if nursing a wound. "He jumped at me when I asked him to pay for the ride," Tom added, his face twisted with a mix of rage and triumph. "I had no choice but to defend myself. He's dangerous, officers. You need to get him away from me." Malcolm's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the full weight of what was happening. He had been in courtrooms enough times to know how easily stories could be twisted, how quickly lies could become accepted as truth, but he had never imagined he would find himself on the other side of such a blatant fabrication. His hands shook as he tried to steady himself, but the officers took his movement as defiance. "I said, get on the ground," the officer shouted again, his voice rising with frustration. He stepped forward and shoved Malcolm's shoulder, sending him sprawling back onto the pavement. "I'm not resisting. Please, listen to me." Malcolm's voice cracked with a mix of fear and desperation. He glanced around at the gathering crowd, hoping that someone, anyone, might step forward to challenge the lies, to tell the officers what really happened. But the faces in the crowd remained impassive, some turning away to avoid being drawn into the conflict. Before Malcolm could say another word, the second officer yanked his arms behind his back and cuffed him with a brutal twist. Pain shot through his shoulders, and he bit down on a cry, feeling the sharp edges of the cuffs cut into his wrists. He could barely hear his own thoughts over the pounding of his heart, over the ringing in his ears as the officers dragged him toward the squad car. Tom watched the scene unfold with a satisfied smirk, leaning casually against his taxi as the police roughly forced Malcolm into the back seat. His act of victimhood had already begun to fade, replaced by a cold, gloating expression that Malcolm would never forget. "Just doing your job, officers," Tom called out to them as they loaded Malcolm into the car. He glanced over at the judge, his eyes flashing with a twisted sense of triumph. "Make sure you keep him behind bars where he belongs." Malcolm tried to hold on to his composure, to focus on his breathing, but the injustice of it all burned through him. He could feel the weight of the handcuffs pressing into his wrists, could taste the bitterness of blood on his tongue. He had been through so many trials in his career, had fought so hard to believe in the idea of justice, but here he was, facing the ugly truth that the system he had once believed in so deeply could turn against him in an instant. As the police car pulled away from the curb, Malcolm caught a final glimpse of the crowd. Some held up their phones, recording the scene with wary expressions, but no one stepped forward. No one spoke out. He wondered if any of them would have the courage to share what they had seen, or if the truth would remain buried beneath Tom's lies. The ride to the precinct felt like it stretched on forever. The officers said nothing, their silence heavy and judgmental, as if they had already made up their minds about what kind of man he was. Malcolm leaned his head against the cool window, staring out at the passing buildings, his mind spinning with thoughts of everything he stood to lose. He had dedicated his life to upholding the law, to ensuring that people received fair trials, that the truth was always revealed in the end. Now he couldn't help but feel the bitter irony of his situation. A judge, stripped of his dignity and rights, being driven to a cell on the basis of lies. He closed his eyes, trying to focus, trying to believe that somehow he could find a way to prove his innocence. When they arrived at the precinct, the officers pulled him out of the car, their grips tight on his arms. Malcolm stumbled as they led him through the back entrance, the fluorescent lights of the station blinding him. For a moment, he heard the murmur of voices, the shuffle of feet, as other officers glanced curiously at the sight of the disheveled man in cuffs. One of the officers pushed him into a small, cold cell and slammed the door shut behind him. The clang of the metal bars echoed through the empty space, a sound that felt like the final note in a symphony of injustice. "You'll stay here until we figure out what to do with you," the officer said, his tone dismissive. "Just sit tight and don't cause any trouble." Malcolm sat on the narrow bench, his hands still cuffed, the cool metal biting into his skin. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of what had just happened, how quickly his life had unraveled. He had never felt so powerless, so stripped of everything he had worked for. Outside the precinct, the streets buzzed with a different kind of energy. Videos of the arrest were making their way across social media, sparking outrage among those who had witnessed the brutality and knew Malcolm's reputation as a respected judge. The hashtags #Justice for Malcolm and #End Police Brutality began to trend as people shared their disbelief and anger over the blatant injustice. Protests began to gather outside the police station, small groups at first, then swelling into hundreds as word spread through the city. People held up signs demanding the release of Malcolm Price, chanting for accountability and change. The voices of the crowd grew louder, echoing through the streets and into the precinct where Malcolm sat, unaware of the movement building outside. In the darkness of his cell, Malcolm wondered if anyone would believe his side of the story, if the truth would ever come to light. He thought of his family, of his colleagues, of the life that seemed to be slipping away from him with every passing second. But even as despair settled over him, a small flicker of hope remained. Hope that someone out there would see the truth, that justice could still be possible. The cold air of the cell bit into Malcolm's skin, amplifying the ache in his bruised body. He leaned against the steel wall, trying to focus on the rhythm of his breathing, but his mind kept returning to the events that had led him here. A wave of anger washed over him, mingling with the deep sense of betrayal. How could everything he believed in, truth, justice, the fairness of the law, be twisted against him so easily? He heard footsteps approaching, the sound echoing off the concrete walls. A police officer appeared, his expression blank as he unlocked the cell door. "Get up. Time for your processing." Malcolm struggled to his feet, feeling a jolt of pain with each movement. He followed the officer down a dim hallway, his wrists still cuffed behind his back, his head throbbing from the beating he'd endured. They brought him to a small room where another officer waited with a camera. "Stand there. Face the camera," the officer barked. Malcolm did as he was told, the flash of the camera blinding him for a moment as they took his mugshot. The indignity of the moment struck him hard. How quickly he had gone from a respected judge to just another man in the system, stripped of his dignity and voice. As they finished processing him, the officers led him back to his cell, ignoring his attempts to explain his side of the story. "Save it for the judge," one of them muttered as he slammed the door shut behind Malcolm. Malcolm collapsed onto the narrow bench, feeling the weight of his situation pressing down on him. He thought of his courtroom, where he had stood so many times, listening to defendants plead their cases. He had always believed in giving each person a fair hearing, in considering every piece of evidence before passing judgment. Now he found himself on the opposite side, and the irony cut deep. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to block out the sounds of the precinct around him. But even as he tried to steady himself, a distant noise caught his attention, a low rumble, growing louder by the minute. He strained to hear, trying to make sense of the muffled sounds. It wasn't until a few hours later, when a different officer came to check on him, that he finally understood. The officer seemed uneasy, his movements quick as he glanced out the small bar-topped window of the cell. Malcolm caught a glimpse of his name tag, Officer Riley. Riley avoided meeting Malcolm's eyes, his expression tight with discomfort. For a moment, Malcolm thought he might have a chance to reason with him. "Officer Riley, you have to believe me," Malcolm began, his voice hoarse. "This is all a misunderstanding. That driver, he lied about everything. There are witnesses, videos. You need to look at the evidence." But Riley cut him off with a dismissive shake of his head. "Look, I'm not the one in charge here, okay? Just keep your head down and stay quiet." He hesitated, glancing out the window again, before adding in a lower voice, "There's a lot of noise outside, a lot of people asking questions about you." With that, he turned and left, leaving Malcolm alone with his thoughts. But Riley's words sparked a flicker of hope. What did he mean by a lot of people? Malcolm pressed his face against the small window, trying to see outside, but the view was blocked. He could only imagine what might be happening beyond the walls of the precinct. Outside, the scene was far from quiet. What had started as a few bystanders recording the arrest had quickly grown into something much larger. The video of Malcolm's arrest, showing the rough treatment he endured and the gloating smirk of the driver, had gone viral on social media. The footage spread like wildfire, shared by thousands who were outraged at the blatant injustice. Comments flooded in from people across the city and beyond, many of whom recognized Malcolm from his work as a judge. "This is a disgrace," read one post. "Judge Price is known for being fair and impartial. How could they treat him like this?" Others shared their own experiences with police bias, turning the story into a rallying cry for those who had suffered similar treatment. By the time the sun began to set, a crowd had gathered outside the precinct. They held signs reading, "Justice for Judge Price," and "End Police Brutality," their voices merging into a chorus of chants that echoed through the streets. "Free Malcolm! Free Malcolm!" they cried, their fists raised in the air. The protesters demanded that the precinct release the judge, that the truth be heard. Reporters arrived on the scene, their cameras capturing the faces of the protesters and the tension that hung in the air. One young woman, who had witnessed the altercation from her apartment window, spoke to a local news station, describing what she had seen. "That driver attacked him first. I saw the whole thing. Judge Price was just defending himself. But the cops, well, they didn't want to listen." The police station was on edge. Officers inside exchanged uneasy glances as they watched the crowd outside swell, chanting louder with every passing hour. The pressure was building, and they knew it. The captain, a grizzled veteran named Henderson, paced back and forth in his office, barking orders into his radio. "Keep that crowd back. We're not letting them dictate how we run this department." But even as Henderson tried to maintain control, he could see the cracks forming. Every time a new video or photo of the arrest hit social media, the demands for Malcolm's release grew louder. More protesters joined the crowd, and news outlets picked up the story, broadcasting it across the nation. The situation was quickly spiraling beyond the precinct's control. Malcolm could hear the faint echoes of the chants from his cell, their voices like a distant heartbeat, pulsing through the concrete walls. He sat on the bench, clutching his aching side, wondering if this was real, if people outside truly cared enough to stand up for him. He thought of all the cases he had overseen, all the times he had tried to do what was right. He had never imagined that he would need the same kind of justice he had fought so hard to uphold. Hours passed, and the tension outside continued to build. The protesters refused to disperse. Despite the growing police presence, some of the officers looked nervously at their colleagues, unsure of how to handle the situation. A few quietly questioned whether they should have arrested Malcolm in the first place, but their doubts were quickly silenced by orders from above. Inside his cell, Malcolm struggled to hold on to hope. He thought of his family, of his friends and colleagues, wondering what they were thinking. If they knew what had happened to him, he could only hope that they believed in his innocence, that they would fight for him as he had fought for so many others. The voices outside grew louder, echoing through the night. "Free Malcolm! Free Malcolm!" The sound was relentless, a constant reminder that the world had not forgotten him, that there were people willing to stand up against injustice. For the first time since his arrest, Malcolm allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the truth would find its way to the surface. The crowd outside the precinct continued to swell, their chants growing louder with each passing hour. Inside, Malcolm could only catch fragments of the noise, but it was enough to give him hope. He had been in the cell for what felt like an eternity, his body aching from the bruises and the cold metal bench. He had lost count of how many times he had replayed the events in his mind, each time trying to figure out how things had gone so terribly wrong. But now, there was a glimmer of something he hadn't dared to feel since his arrest: hope. He could sense that the people outside weren't going anywhere. They were demanding justice, and for the first time since he had been dragged into this nightmare, he felt like he might have a chance. The door to the cell block creaked open, and Malcolm looked up, expecting another indifferent officer. But instead, he saw a new face, a young woman in a sharp suit, her expression one of focused determination. She introduced herself as Clara Bennett, a civil rights lawyer. She had been following the story, she explained, and she believed that Malcolm's case was a clear-cut example of injustice. "Judge Price, I've seen the videos," Clara said, her voice low but urgent. "There are recordings of your arrest all over social media. The witnesses, many of them saw what really happened. They're demanding your release, and I'm here to make sure your voice is heard. If you'll let me, I'd like to represent you." Malcolm blinked, trying to process her words. He had expected to be forgotten, to be left to languish in this cell until the system crushed him entirely. But now, with Clara standing in front of him, he felt a flicker of hope reignite. He nodded, trying to keep his voice steady despite the emotions welling up inside him. "Thank you. I appreciate it. Please help me prove that I'm innocent," he said, his voice cracking slightly. Clara offered him a brief, reassuring smile before turning to the officer who had brought her down to the cells. "I need to speak with your commanding officer immediately," she said, her tone firm. "There are clear discrepancies between the arrest report and the evidence available. I demand that Judge Price be allowed to present his side in court as soon as possible." The officer hesitated, clearly caught off guard by Clara's assertiveness, but eventually he nodded and led her away. Malcolm watched her go, feeling a surge of gratitude and relief. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to hope that the truth might come to light. Outside the precinct, the protests had reached a boiling point. Clara wasted no time in rallying support, organizing a legal team, and gathering statements from witnesses. She filed a motion to appeal Malcolm's arrest, citing the viral videos as evidence of police misconduct. News of her efforts spread quickly, and soon the story reached national headlines. The precinct captain, Henderson, found himself facing intense pressure from both the public and his own officers, many of whom were growing uncomfortable with the way things were unfolding. Reporters bombarded him with questions about the integrity of the arrest, about the decision to take the word of a taxi driver over a respected judge. Each time he tried to deflect, the public's outrage only seemed to grow. But Henderson wasn't about to back down. He had spent years building his reputation, and he wasn't about to let one high-profile case destroy it. He called in additional officers, reinforcing the perimeter around the precinct as the crowd continued to grow. Inside, Malcolm met with Clara again, this time in the cramped visitation room. She laid out the plan in detail, her voice steady despite the urgency of the situation. "We have a strong case, Judge Price. The videos clearly show that the driver was the aggressor, and there's footage of the officers using excessive force. But it won't be easy. Henderson's doing everything he can to keep this quiet." Malcolm nodded, absorbing her words. He felt the weight of his situation, but he also felt the strength of the movement that had formed outside the precinct walls. "What do we do next?" he asked, his voice tinged with determination. "We take this to court," Clara replied, her eyes flashing with resolve. "I've filed for an emergency hearing. We're going to make sure the judge sees the video, hears the witnesses, and understands that you were the victim of a false accusation, and we're going to demand your release." The next few days were a blur of legal motions, media coverage, and escalating protests. Clara worked tirelessly, collecting statements from witnesses who had been there that day, many of whom had recorded the altercation on their phones. She filed a civil rights lawsuit on Malcolm's behalf, accusing the police department of wrongful arrest and excessive force. As the legal proceedings began to unfold, the pressure on the police department mounted. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, eager for updates on the case that had captured the nation's attention. Clara gave a brief press statement, her voice confident as she spoke to the cameras. "This is about more than one man's arrest," she said, her words cutting through the noise. "This is about accountability, about making sure that no one, regardless of their race or position, should be treated this way. Judge Price deserves his day in court, and we're going to make sure he gets it." In the courthouse, the atmosphere was electric. Malcolm's case had become a symbol of a larger struggle, and people filled the gallery, eager to see justice served. Malcolm sat beside Clara, his hands clenched tightly together as he listened to her present the evidence. She played the videos on a large screen for the court, showing the clear sequence of events, the driver's aggression, the unjustified arrest, and the harsh treatment by the officers. The prosecution tried to undermine the footage, arguing that the videos were edited, that they didn't show the full picture. But Clara countered with witness testimony, one after another, taking the stand to describe what they had seen that day. A young woman who had recorded the arrest on her phone described how she had seen the driver hit Malcolm first, how she had heard the racist remarks that followed. The tension in the room was palpable as the judge deliberated, flipping through the evidence with a furrowed brow. Malcolm sat with his head held high, trying to mask the anxiety that knotted his stomach. He had been on the other side of this process so many times, but now, with his future hanging in the balance, he felt every second stretch into an eternity. Finally, the judge cleared his throat and addressed the courtroom. After reviewing the evidence, including the video recordings and witness statements, it is clear that the circumstances of Judge Price's arrest were gravely mishandled. The actions of the arresting officers were unjustified, and the claims made by the taxi driver were found to be inconsistent with the evidence. The court orders the immediate release of Judge Malcolm Price and further investigation into the conduct of those involved. A wave of relief swept over Malcolm, leaving him momentarily speechless. He turned to Clara, who offered him a triumphant smile, her own eyes shining with emotion. The gallery erupted into applause, and Malcolm felt tears sting his eyes as he realized that he was finally free. Outside the courthouse, the protesters had gathered, waiting for news. When word of Malcolm's release reached them, a cheer went up, the sound carrying through the streets. They held their signs high, chanting his name, their voices filled with hope. Malcolm stepped out of the courthouse into the warm sunlight, feeling the weight of the past days lift from his shoulders. He looked out at the faces of those who had fought for him, strangers who had refused to let his story be forgotten. He took a deep breath, knowing that this fight was only the beginning. Clara stood beside him, her expression serious despite the victory. "You're free, Judge Price, but we've still got a lot of work to do. The system that did this to you, it needs to change." Malcolm nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that he couldn't just go back to his old life, that he had a responsibility to use his experience to fight for those who didn't have the same platform he did. As he looked out at the crowd, he felt a swell of gratitude and a promise to keep fighting, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be. Malcolm stepped out of the courthouse into the glaring afternoon sun, blinking as he tried to adjust to the sudden brightness. He paused for a moment, taking in the scene around him. The crowd outside the courthouse had swelled into a sea of faces, their cheers ringing through the air like a wave. For a moment, he was overwhelmed by the sheer energy of it. The signs demanding justice, the chants of his name, the tears and smiles on faces he had never seen before. Clara stood beside him, her arm lightly resting on his shoulder. She leaned in closer, her voice barely audible over the noise. "They're here for you, Judge Price. This is your moment." Malcolm took a deep breath, letting the weight of her words settle over him. He nodded, then stepped forward toward the edge of the courthouse steps. The crowd quieted slightly as he raised his hand, their expectant faces turning up to him. He had spent so many years speaking from the bench, passing judgment, but now the words he spoke felt different, personal, raw, and deeply meaningful. "Thank you," he began, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Thank you for standing with me, for refusing to let this injustice go unnoticed. What happened to me is just one example of a larger problem, a problem that too many people in our community face every day. Today, I am free, but this fight is far from over." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Malcolm felt a sense of solidarity sweep over him. He thought of all the faces he had seen during the legal battle, the people who had shared their own stories of injustice and discrimination. He thought of those who never had their day in court, whose stories remained buried beneath the weight of a system that had failed them. "I promise you this," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "I will not rest until we see real change. We deserve a system that treats every person with dignity and fairness. We deserve a future where no one has to fear for their life because of the color of their skin. And together, we will build that future, because together, we are stronger than those who try to silence us." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing off the courthouse walls. Malcolm stepped back, overwhelmed by the support that surrounded him. He felt Clara's reassuring presence at his side, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself to believe that this nightmare might lead to something better. As the crowd began to disperse, Clara guided Malcolm toward a waiting car. Reporters rushed forward, their cameras flashing as they called out questions, but she held up a hand, offering them a polite but firm smile. "Judge Price will make a full statement in due time. For now, he needs to rest." The drive away from the courthouse was quiet, but Malcolm felt a sense of peace settle over him. He looked out the window, watching the city pass by, a city that had changed in the days he had been locked away. He could see the signs of the protests, the chalk messages of support, scrawled on sidewalks, the murals that had sprung up on buildings. He knew that his story had touched something deep within the community, something that had been waiting to break free for a long time. When they arrived at his home, Malcolm was greeted by his family, their faces lined with relief and joy. His mother wrapped him in a tight hug, her tears soaking into his shirt. His father, always a man of few words, simply clapped him on the back, his expression softening with pride. Malcolm embraced them, feeling the strength of their support fill the cracks that the ordeal had left in his spirit. As the sun set and the city quieted, Malcolm found himself standing on his balcony, looking out over the lights of the neighborhood. He knew that his fight was far from over. There would be more challenges, more struggles to come, but he also knew that he was not alone. Clara had already laid out the next steps, pursuing legal action against the taxi driver for assault, pressing charges against the officers for wrongful arrest, and advocating for broader reforms within the police department. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Clara and her team filed lawsuits calling for accountability from both the taxi driver and the officers involved. The pressure on the police department intensified as more stories of misconduct surfaced, each one fueling the public's demand for change. Captain Henderson, who had tried so desperately to contain the situation, found himself at the center of an internal investigation, his reputation crumbling under the weight of his actions. The legal battle against the officers was particularly intense. In court, Clara presented the videos of the arrest, highlighting the excessive force and the clear lack of probable cause. Witnesses took the stand, describing how they had seen Malcolm thrown to the ground, how they had heard the officer's dismissive comments, and seen the smirk on Tom's face as he fabricated his story. The courtroom was packed with spectators, many of whom had been at the protests. Malcolm sat beside Clara, listening as the truth he had fought so hard to bring to light finally had its day in court. The prosecution struggled to defend the actions of the police, their arguments falling flat in the face of overwhelming evidence. Finally, the judge delivered his verdict, his voice firm as he addressed the courtroom. The actions of the arresting officers were found to be in violation of civil rights, and the accusations made by the taxi driver were proven to be false. The officers involved will face disciplinary action, and Mr. Tom will be charged with assault and false reporting. This court recognizes the courage of Judge Price in standing up against this injustice, and we hope that this case serves as a reminder that no one is above the law. A wave of satisfaction washed over Malcolm as he heard the judge's words. He looked over at Clara, who gave him a nod, her eyes filled with pride. The gallery erupted into applause, and Malcolm felt a sense of closure settle over him. It wasn't just about his freedom. It was about proving that the truth could prevail, even in a system that so often felt stacked against people like him. In the weeks that followed, the protests continued, evolving into a broader movement for police reform. Malcolm found himself at the forefront of this movement, using his platform to speak out about the changes that were needed. He met with city officials, pushing for new policies that would ensure transparency and accountability. And with each speech he gave, with each rally he attended, he saw the faces of those who believed in the same vision, a future where justice truly meant justice for all. One evening, as he stood on the steps of City Hall after a long day of meetings, a young man approached him. He held up a phone, showing Malcolm the video that had changed everything, the footage of his arrest, which had sparked a movement. "I was one of the people who shared this," the young man said, his voice filled with emotion. "I just wanted to say, thank you. You've given us hope." Malcolm smiled, feeling the weight of those words settle in his chest. He reached out and shook the young man's hand, his grip firm and steady. "No," he replied softly. "Thank you. None of this would have been possible without people like you." As he walked back to his car, Malcolm felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known in months. The road ahead was long, and the work was far from finished, but he knew that they were moving in the right direction. He had faced the darkness, and with the help of those who believed in him, he had found his way back into the light. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that true change was possible. This story has shown that even in the darkest moments, you can find hope and achieve justice. But this is not the end. New challenges and important battles lie ahead. If you liked this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss new stories about the struggle for truth and justice. Leave comments on what you think about this story and what conclusions you have drawn. And also, don't forget to watch our other videos. Each story carries an important lesson and will make you think.